Evil rarely announces itself with screams or chaos. More often, it slips quietly into ordinary lives, hiding behind familiar faces, routine habits, and the comforting illusion of normalcy. William Clyde Gibson III was one such presence. He lived in small Indiana towns where people recognized him by sight, where bartenders knew his drink, and where neighbors believed they understood the man living just a few doors away. No one imagined that behind the calm exterior existed a growing hunger for control, violence, and domination. This is not the story of a monster born overnight. It is the story of a man who unraveled slowly, predictably, and dangerously. A boy who struggled to belong. A teenager who discovered alcohol before responsibility. A man who learned, again and again, that punishment was temporary and forgiveness was easy. Each mistake was met with another chance, and each chance pushed him closer to the edge. William Clyde Gibson did not run from the law. He did not disappear after his crimes. He stayed. He worked jobs. He attended church. He helped his aging mother. To outsiders, he appeared flawed but manageable, troubled but harmless. That illusion would cost 3 women their lives. What makes Gibson's story especially chilling is how often the warning signs were documented. Psychologists evaluated him. Courts processed him. Prisons released him. Each system concluded the same thing. He was difficult, impulsive, and dangerous in theory, but not dangerous enough in practice. Time after time, he was sent back into the world. When the violence finally erupted, it was not sudden. It was deliberate. A murder committed on his own birthday. Another hidden beneath the soil of his backyard. A third carried out against a woman who trusted him completely. And when he was finally caught, Gibson showed no panic, no urgency to explain himself. Instead, he spoke calmly, almost casually. This story is not told to sensationalize evil. It is told to understand how it survives unnoticed. Tonight, we step inside the life, crimes, and chilling aftermath of William Clyde Gibson III. The consequences of ignoring evil would prove devastating. William Clyde Gibson III entered the world on October 10, 1957, the youngest child in a working-class American family. On the surface, his upbringing lacked the extreme horrors often associated with violent offenders. There were no documented beatings, no institutional neglect, no obvious cruelty that could later be offered as a convenient explanation. Gibson himself would later insist that his childhood was stable, even comfortable. Yet stability can still be deeply flawed. His father worked long hours and drank heavily. Alcohol changed his temperament, turning ordinary frustration into unpredictable aggression. His mother compensated by becoming overprotective, shielding young William from consequences and reinforcing dependence rather than resilience. The household was neither loving nor brutal, but emotionally inconsistent, creating an environment where boundaries blurred and accountability weakened. From early childhood, Gibson struggled socially. He found it difficult to communicate with peers, avoided eye contact, and withdrew into himself. Teachers noted learning difficulties and poor impulse control. While other children formed friendships, Gibson hovered on the edges, watching, absorbing, resenting. His awkwardness made him an easy target. Bullying followed him through his earliest school years, slowly fermenting humiliation into anger. Something shifted as he grew older and physically larger. By the time he reached middle school, Gibson was no longer an easy victim. He began to retaliate not defensively, but excessively. Fights became frequent. Discipline lost meaning. Authority figures were challenged rather than feared. The boy who once avoided attention now seemed to crave confrontation. Outside school, his behavior grew increasingly troubling. Neighbors and former friends would later describe incidents that felt disturbing even in retrospect. There were stories of reckless cruelty, of animals harmed, of threats made without provocation. Whether exaggerated or accurate, they painted a consistent picture of a young man experimenting with power. At 13, Gibson began drinking alcohol. Not as rebellion, but as routine. Drinking dulled his anxiety and fueled his aggression. That same year, he was arrested for stealing a motorbike. The punishment was minimal, but the lesson was lasting. Crime did not equal catastrophe. Consequences were survivable. Education faded from relevance. Gibson dropped out of school and drifted into petty crimes, intoxication, and unstable employment. His life lacked direction, but it did not lack momentum. Each bad decision fed the next. Drunk driving incidents ended with warnings. Crashes ended with repairs. Nothing ever truly stopped him. When Gibson enlisted in the United States Army, family members hoped discipline would succeed where parenting had failed. Structure might impose order. Responsibility might force maturity. For a brief moment, it appeared to work. Gibson performed well mechanically and excelled in weapons training. He earned commendations for marksmanship, demonstrating focus and control when violence was regulated and rewarded. Off-duty, however, the pattern reemerged. Gibson began using drugs heavily, mixing heroin, cocaine, and hallucinogens with alcohol. Addiction layered itself onto existing impulsivity, stripping away inhibition. The same institution that trained him to handle weapons also documented his thefts, insubordination, and escalating misconduct. In 1979, Gibson was dishonorably discharged for stealing a vehicle. Prison followed. Inside confinement, he attempted suicide by slashing his wrists. Whether it was despair or manipulation remained unclear, but the attempt failed. He survived, once again spared from final consequence. Psychological evaluations during incarceration revealed low intelligence, poor judgment, and antisocial tendencies. What they did not reveal was insanity. Gibson understood right from wrong. He simply chose himself over others, consistently and without hesitation. Upon release, he returned to civilian life unchanged. Crime resumed. Alcohol resumed. Drugs resumed. Relationships formed briefly, then collapsed under violence and theft. Law enforcement encountered him repeatedly, yet each case was treated in isolation. No single crime seemed catastrophic enough to warrant permanent removal from society. This pattern would define Gibson's life for decades. Arrest, evaluation, release. Warning, forgiveness, repetition. Each cycle reinforced his belief that rules were temporary obstacles, not absolute limits. He learned patience. He learned how to wait. By the time Gibson entered his 30s, something darker had taken root. His crimes were no longer reckless accidents fueled by intoxication. They were becoming intentional, personal, and increasingly sexual. Violence was no longer collateral damage. It was becoming the objective. The foundation had been laid. The conditions were set. The slow burn of resentment, addiction, and unchecked behavior was nearing ignition. The man William Clyde Gibson had become was no longer merely unstable. He was dangerous, and the world around him remained unaware. By the early 1990s, William Clyde Gibson III had crossed an invisible threshold. His behavior was no longer limited to impulsive acts driven by intoxication or desperation. Violence was becoming deliberate, purposeful, and increasingly centered on dominance. The legal system continued to encounter him, but never long enough to fully recognize the threat he posed. In January 1991, Gibson was involved in a traffic accident while backing his pickup truck. Instead of stopping, he fled. A police officer attempted pursuit, triggering a high-speed chase through public roads. The chase ended violently when Gibson crashed into another vehicle, severely injuring the other driver and breaking multiple ribs. Gibson survived with head injuries and stitches. Once again, his recklessness nearly killed someone, yet he lived to walk away. Only months later, his violence took a deeply disturbing turn. Gibson sexually assaulted a 21-year-old woman in Kentucky. The attack occurred in a public area, demonstrating his growing confidence and lack of fear. When arrested, Gibson denied responsibility, blaming alcohol and circumstance. His defense attorney argued mental instability, prompting court-ordered psychological evaluations. The conclusions were direct and unsettling. Gibson possessed below-average intelligence and poor emotional regulation, but he was fully aware of his actions. He understood the nature of his crime. He understood its consequences. There was no psychosis, no delusion, no inability to distinguish right from wrong. In legal terms, he was competent. Despite the severity of the crime, Gibson accepted an Alford plea, avoiding a full admission of guilt. He was sentenced to prison but refused to participate meaningfully in sex offender treatment. He rejected accountability, dismissed victim impact, and framed himself as misunderstood rather than dangerous. Still, institutional assessments labeled him unlikely to reoffend. That judgment would prove tragically wrong. Released back into society, Gibson registered as a sex offender and attempted to rebuild his life. He entered relationships, found temporary housing, and drifted between short-term jobs. To some acquaintances, he appeared functional. To others, unsettling. Beneath the surface, resentment festered. Substance abuse resumed almost immediately. Former partners accused him of violence. One woman reported being attacked and restrained by Gibson during an argument. Visible injuries supported her claims, yet the case was ultimately dropped. Evidence was deemed insufficient. Once again, Gibson avoided lasting consequences. In the years that followed, he was arrested for theft and sentenced to additional prison time. During one sentence, he was transferred to a state hospital for substance abuse treatment. Staff described him as disengaged, resistant, and manipulative. Psychiatrists briefly diagnosed bipolar disorder and prescribed medication, though later evaluations found no consistent evidence of mental illness. Gibson learned something important during these years. He learned how to appear compliant, how to say enough to satisfy evaluators without changing internally. He earned an associate degree while incarcerated, presenting himself as rehabilitated. His outward behavior softened. His inner impulses did not. When he was released again, Gibson found work and settled into the community. He attended church regularly. He helped care for his aging mother. Neighbors described him as polite, quiet, and helpful. The same man who had committed sexual assault and violent theft now blended seamlessly into everyday life. Bars remained his refuge. There, Gibson's mask slipped. He drank heavily, fixated on women, and spoke in ways that made others uncomfortable. He frequently asked women to accompany him home. Sometimes they refused. Sometimes they accepted. Each encounter fed his sense of control. On October 10, 2002, Gibson met 44-year-old Karen Suhodela at a bar. It was his birthday. Alcohol flowed freely. Conversation turned into companionship. By the end of the night, they were alone together. An argument followed. Accusations were made. Rage surfaced. Gibson stabbed Karen repeatedly and discarded her body in a remote area. There was no frantic escape, no panicked flight. He returned to his routine, going back to bars, jobs, and familiar streets. Later, he tattooed the date of the murder onto his arm, accompanied by a knife. It was not an act of mourning. It was a trophy. Karen's body would not be discovered for months. By then, Gibson was already moving forward, untouched by suspicion. He had killed, and nothing had stopped him. The system had failed repeatedly, and Gibson had learned its limits. Violence had evolved from impulse to intention. The escalation was complete, and the most dangerous chapter of his life was about to begin. For nearly a decade after Karen Suhodela's murder, William Clyde Gibson III lived undetected. He worked jobs, socialized at bars, and moved through the same neighborhoods where people recognized his face but never questioned his past. The absence of consequences reinforced his belief that he was untouchable. Violence, once tested, had proven effective. It had granted him control, secrecy, and survival. In late 2011, the final stabilizing presence in Gibson's life began to disappear. His mother, whom he had lived with and cared for, was admitted to a nursing home. Her illness disrupted the fragile routine that had kept him outwardly functional. When she died in January 2012, Gibson lost the last restraint anchoring him to normalcy. Within weeks, the violence returned. On March 24, 2012, Gibson met 35-year-old Stephanie Marie Kirk at a local bar. They spent the day drinking, using drugs, and engaging in consensual intimacy. As with Karen, the situation shifted abruptly. An argument erupted over prescription pills. Control slipped. Rage replaced reason. Stephanie never left Gibson's home alive. After killing her, Gibson buried her body in his backyard. The act was deliberate and calculated. He covered her remains beneath soil and routine, confident that no one would look beneath the surface. For weeks, he lived above her grave, drinking, sleeping, and carrying on as though nothing had changed. Less than a month later, on April 18, 2012, 75-year-old Christine Whitus visited Gibson at his mother's house. She had been a longtime family friend and supporter, offering emotional and financial help when others had given up. She trusted him completely. That trust cost her life. Gibson raped and strangled Christine, then mutilated her body. Unlike the previous murder, he made no effort to conceal what he had done. Her body was left in the garage, surrounded by garbage bags, as if reduced to refuse. It was a shocking escalation, signaling a complete collapse of restraint. The following day, Gibson's sister arrived at the house to manage their late mother's estate. When she discovered Christine's body, she immediately contacted police. Hours later, Gibson was arrested for driving under the influence in Christine's vehicle. The case unraveled quickly. Confronted with evidence, Gibson did not resist. He confessed calmly to Christine's murder. Then, without hesitation, he admitted to killing Karen Hodella years earlier. Finally, he led investigators to the spot in his backyard where Stephanie Kirk was buried. 3 women, 3 confessions, no visible remorse. During interrogation, Gibson claimed that an evil overcame him during the murders. He spoke of losing control, yet his actions told a different story. He remembered details. He concealed bodies. He avoided detection. Evaluators again found him sane, competent, and fully responsible. The trials moved swiftly. In October 2013, Gibson was convicted of Christine Whitus's murder. The jury deliberated for less than 20 minutes. During sentencing, he was given the death penalty. His reaction was chillingly indifferent. He told the judge that it was no big deal and that he deserved it. Awaiting further trials, Gibson displayed behavior that disturbed even seasoned officials. He tattooed Death Row X3 onto his scalp, a grim acknowledgement of the sentences he expected. Courts ordered his hair not be cut, fearing the tattoo could influence jurors. Rather than contest his guilt, Gibson pleaded guilty in the remaining cases. In August 2014, he received a second death sentence for Stephanie Kirk's murder, along with a lengthy prison term for Karen Hodella's killing. The court described death as the only appropriate punishment. From death row, Gibson sought attention. He participated in documentaries, interviews, and podcasts. In these appearances, he claimed responsibility for more than 30 additional murders across multiple states. He spoke of cannibalism and unsolved cases, portraying himself as far more prolific than proven evidence suggested. Authorities investigated his claims. None were substantiated. Experts believe Gibson exaggerated to maintain relevance and control. Yet they caution that serial offenders often blend truth with fiction, leaving uncertainty behind. Whether Gibson killed more remains unknown. Today, William Clyde Gibson III sits on Indiana's death row. 3 confirmed victims. Dozens of unanswered questions. His story stands as a stark reminder of what happens when warning signs are documented, dismissed, and ignored, until violence becomes inevitable. If this story left you unsettled, that is intentional. True crime is not mere entertainment. It is a lens to examine human behavior, societal failures, and the systems that sometimes fail to prevent tragedy. William Clyde Gibson III did not become a killer overnight. His life was shaped by a series of missed warning signs. Early antisocial behavior, escalating substance abuse, repeated brushes with the law, and failures of rehabilitation. Each unheeded alert, each lenient sentence, each dismissal of red flags brought him closer to the point of no return. By studying cases like Gibson's, we can understand not only the methods of a dangerous mind but also the importance of vigilance, accountability, and early intervention. This is about victims as much as it is about perpetrators. Every life cut short carries a ripple effect. Families shattered, communities haunted, and questions that may never be answered. Awareness is the first step toward prevention. If you value responsibly told, deeply research true crime stories that explore the psychology, investigation, and societal implications of these crimes, consider supporting this channel. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Engage with the content. Comment below your thoughts on whether Gibson exaggerated his confessions or whether there may be more victims the world will never know. Remember, monsters do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they live next door. Sometimes they sit quietly in a bar. Awareness and vigilance are our best defenses against them. Share this story, discuss it responsibly, and keep these lessons alive. Not for shock, but for understanding.